It's an honor to be here and be asked to speak before you. I want to thank the Weatherhead and Professor Myron Cohen for inviting me, and also for Gregory Mosher allowing us to come over and play. This panel explores the relationship between Colombia and China by inviting reflections on past encounters, while also looking towards the future of Colombia-China relations. So I'd like to begin with the future and then slowly proceed to the past. French economist Jacques Attali writes that noises of society are in advance of its images and material conflicts, just as we hear a train before it approaches the station. In this way, music is a way of understanding the world because it lets us hear the future. As last night's concert illustrates, jazz represents one fertile path of present and future Colombia-China relations, a cultural diplomacy in sound and artistic exchange. For those of you who missed the performance, which was sponsored by the Arts Initiative at Columbia University, a group comprised of Columbia students and faculty collaborated with some of the most important musicians in Beijing, debuting 7 new compositions which sonically explored contemporary and future China and Colombia relations. But this was not some new idea. Cross-cultural exchange had been sounding in both classical music and jazz throughout the 20th century, both at Columbia and in jazz in general. In fact, the music department at Columbia has been shaped in part by a long relationship with Chinese scholars and students. Of most significance is the department's longtime association with composer Cho Wen-chung, who was born in Yantai and immigrated to the United States in 1946. Beginning in the 1950s, he worked as an assistant in the electronic music studio at Columbia, eventually going on to teach composition. In addition to his professorial work, Cho founded the Center for U.S.-China Arts Exchange, and as a composer, he is regarded as one of the founders of contemporary Chinese composition. He attracted many gifted Chinese students to the department, a tradition which has continued to the present, many of whom have become important figures in music and academia, both in China and the United States, such as composers Zhou Long, Chen Yi, and Tan Dun. Since the mid-1960s, the music department has offered courses on Chinese music traditions. The first was Asian Music Humanities. Most likely, these were the first classes of their kind offered in an American university. And in the late 1980s, Asian Music Humanities classes became a part of the core curriculum, solidifying the place of Asian music studies at Columbia for the future. The Center for Ethnomusicology in the music department also now has a number of Asian music ensembles among their performance course offerings. Jazz is often marked specifically as an American cultural contribution, but this perspective often ignores the global nature of the music and its business. Looking at jazz in China offers a much more complex picture. In 1922, just 5 years after the first jazz recording was made, and 3 years after the first jazz band toured abroad, they went to Europe, not Asia, Burnett Hershey, an innovative journalist for the New York Times, took a trip around the world documenting where jazz was played. He called the article Jazz Latitude, and it appeared in the New York Times on June 25, 1922. He reported, quote, "Jazz latitude is marked as indelibly on the globe as the heavy line of the equator. Jazz is the new idol in China, the temple of temples where His Pagan Highness King Jazz is worshipped in the Orient is Shanghai, Paris of the East. Jazz has come to mean Shanghai. Shanghai without jazz would not be Shanghai. Jazz is the essence of its existence." I don't think that was even written about New York in 1922. He goes on to document specific clubs and musicians that regularly featured jazz and comments on how jazz was locally inflected. Of course, his American-centric viewpoint offers little insight into an essence of Shanghai in 1922, if one can identify such a thing. It says much more about his ignorance of China and its culture. However, what is valuable about this document is that it provides evidence of how quickly jazz became global and through its travels became transformed in the process. In fact, the influence of Chinese culture on the jazz world was widespread by the 1920s, And in many ways, the roots of jazz were already touched by Chinese traditions. One source of this connection stemmed from Chinese laborers, which were brought to Cuba from the mid-1800s. Cuban music was very influential on early New Orleans music traditions. In fact, in 1875, a Chinese opera company was founded in Havana. And according to some estimates, Havana had the largest Chinese community in the Western Hemisphere by the late 1800s. The music traditions of these new members of Cuban society had a significant impact on the local traditions. The suona, or corneto china as they call it in Cuba, is a double reed instrument brought to Cuba by the Chinese immigrants and is still the lead instrument in comparsa songs or carnival songs. I'd like to play you a brief clip that was recorded just a few years ago in Santiago de Cuba. And many people account for that. The high pitch of this instrument is part of the aesthetic of Latin dance music today. It's louder in a minute. In Cuba was Bombín de Barreto, written by Jose Urfe, named for a bowler hat that was worn by one of his friends. Notice the Chinese pentatonic melody. Jirti. Tin Pan Alley and American popular music grew enamored with Chinese-themed pieces. Throughout the 1920s, songs like Chinatown, My Chinatown, The Chinese Lullaby, The China Boy were recorded hundreds of times by the top artists of the day. Jazz artists drew heavily from this exotica repertoire. In fact, in 1924, the Fletcher Henderson Band, which was one of the top bands in New York City, recorded the hit that became #1, and it was entitled The Shanghai Shuffle. And it features a very young Louis Armstrong playing a trumpet solo. Notice the gliss and the swoops in the intro, and also the Chinese cymbals that are being struck, which are meant to mimic Chinese folk music. Turning back to China, as Hershey's statements attest, jazz in Shanghai was flourishing at a very early stage in the history of the music. This was a direct result of commerce in the port city, stemming from the trans-Pacific traffic of trade. By 1930, a vibrant African-American community was established in Shanghai, made up of cabaret entertainers and workers from the shipping trade. And throughout the mid to late 1930s, Shanghai was a regular stop on the Asian touring circuit for jazz bands, which would begin on the West Coast and trace a circuitous route around the Pacific Rim. Clubs like the Canadrome, pictured here, were active until 1937 when the outbreak of hostilities between Japan and China began. Also Russian bands, Filipino bands, East Indian bands, and local Chinese bands played jazz on the scene. It was a very cosmopolitan milieu, much more so than New York City in the 1930s. Pictured here is Buck Clayton's band, an American trumpet player that played with Count Basie in the 1930s, playing with his band at the Canadrome. Jazz in Shanghai continued to flourish to varying degrees until the Communist Revolution in 1949, and remained popular in spite of how critics from both the political left and right derided it as yellow music, meaning pornographic, tainted by its association with decadence. I would like to end today with two comparative examples. Li Jinghui, a controversial figure who among many other activities was known as the father of Chinese popular music because in the 1920s and 30s he combined local Chinese opera and folk traditions with jazz and led the first all-Chinese jazz band, which was very popular in the Shanghai cabarets. He also collaborated extensively with Buck Clayton, pictured here. In 1928, he composed a composition called Express Train, and it was recorded and released in 1932. One of the most popular singers of the day, Zhou Juan, is the featured vocalist. I want to thank one of Lydia's former students, Andrew Jones, who sent me the MP3 of this. The majority of the recordings from this period had been destroyed and only exist in private collections, and so these are very difficult to come by. This song is not really about a train, it's about a couple who meets and they decide to get married like 5 minutes later. So I guess it's an express train of love. I think what I'd like to do is play it in its entirety. It's only 2.5 minutes long, but it's well worth it. About their marriage, but what's remarkable about this, and I'll conclude momentarily, what's remarkable about this recording is that it was released 1 year before Duke Ellington's #1 hit of 1933, which was entitled Daybreak Express. We'll just listen to the beginning of this. train-inspired pieces that came after this. We don't know if Duke Ellington heard the version that came out in 1932. And possibly it was just a simultaneous invention. As Andrew Jones writes, the functional simultaneity of this sort of musical innovation ought to signal the extent to which both composers were participating in a globalized musical idiom for which the speed of modern transport and communications were a fundamental condition of possibility. Both songs go beyond mere mimesis. They are self-conscious attempts to represent those conditions in musical terms. Only recently, a number of scholars have encouraged the study of jazz as a global phenomenon, and Shanghai's jazz scene is no doubt a strong argument for this approach. Taylor Atkins writes that jazz, both as a socio-cultural force and as a musical idiom, is significantly impaired by construing it as a narrowly national art, expressive of uniquely American experiences and characteristics, and splendidly autonomous from the considerations of global politics, cultural power, and national identity. Examining jazz in its various locally inflected manifestations provides insight into how political, social, and economic forces operate in shaping the sound of jazz. China provides a great opportunity for just that. Thank you.